the invasion for the continent. The focus of this webinar is not to look for the reasons of war, but to have a better understanding of what is happening locally and globally, and how an African continent might be affected. We already had our first webinar on the 2nd of June that focused on the food security, and the recording of that webinar will be available on the CST and the SIRE YouTube channels and on our web pages. So you're welcome to look. Today's webinar is focusing on the implication of the war on global system, UN system and developmental aid. This webinar will be coordinated by me, Zvinka Kacho. I'm a fellow researcher at the Center for Sustainability Transition, and Steve Hrust from SIRE. We have three valuable speakers, and Mr. Vladislav Rashkovan from International Monetary Fund, Priyal Singh from Institute of Security Studies, and Yuanzi from UNISA. We will start with Mr. Vladislav Rashkovan. He holds the position of alternate executive director for Ukraine and is responsible at the executive board not only for Ukraine, but also for 14 other countries. Prior to joining IMF, he served as a deputy governor of the National Bank of Ukraine and was responsible for developing and implementing the banking sector reform. He also has 8 years of experience as CFO at the UniCredit Group. Vladislav Rashkovan is a graduate of the Odessa State Economic University and also worked as a researcher at the University of Genova in Italy and the Institute of the World Economics of the Hungarian Academy of Science. He served on the board of the Kiev School of Economics between 2012 and 2014. So Vladislav, welcome, and thanks a lot for finding the time to talk to us today.
Thanks, Zvinka. Actually, I represent not only Ukraine, but 15 more countries, because Andorra was the country number 190, which joined the fund. And the countries which I mostly represent are European, a little bit of Caucasus, but clearly, the Africa is in our core attention in all the board meetings, and I have good friends among the offices in the both in African department, but also in the offices of executive directors. Look, as we just discussed a few minutes ago before the meeting, I would love to have a meeting with you on different occasions, so to discuss more flourish Africa, how to bring prosperity or climate issues, and how to help with many other topics. But we are currently in the war, and the war in my own country, which affects not only my country, not only the population of my country, European country in Europe, but also many other countries in the world. And that Zvinka said that we are like in the 100th days, so it's the 104th day today, but as we say in Ukraine, this war lasts not for 100 days. This is 104th days of the 8-year war, which lasts centuries. Russia just behaves as a last empire, which still tries to pursue its strategy towards its neighbors with ideas to restore the USSR, the Soviet Union. And so it's clearly a colonial war, which is so familiar with so many countries in Africa. And the current stage, these like 100 days of the current stage of the war, has dramatic consequences for my economy, for Ukrainian economy, and just to say a few of them. First, Ukraine has experienced really large losses of the human and physical capital, and the toll for the economy is very heavy. And Ukrainian pre-war population, as you might know, was around 40 million people, 40+ million people, and currently up to 7 million people fled abroad as refugees during the last 3.5 months. And this is according to the United Nations statistics, this is the second largest, I'll say the outflow of people after the Second World War. So something which the world has not seen much, but I understand that many countries in Africa have seen the refugees as a result of different wars. And so you understand how painful it could be for the countries. But on top of these 7 million people, around 8 million people in Ukraine are internally displaced. So they have the internally displaced status. And on top of that, 10 million people are living on the front line. So if you add up, you see that more than half of Ukrainian population of the large European country is currently affected by the war. 500,000 Ukrainians are forcefully deported to the northern and eastern regions of Russia without the right to return home. These are the statistics which I have, but the official statistics. But I think the data could be much higher, and this amount also includes a lot of kids. 100,000 of kids have been deported from Ukraine, to Russia forcefully, and this is exactly like Russia did both in 1940s, but also like they did in 2014 with Crimea and Donbass. And this is, clearly a way how they want to really like erase Ukrainian nation from the map. Speaking about economy, from February, if you speak about only February, March, April, export and imports in the 2 months fell by 55% and 65% respectively. You understand how big shock this is for the pretty big economy in Europe. And exports via the seaports, including grain, is substantially blocked. Is fully blocked now by the Russian troops in the Black Sea. It is estimated. It's still very, very difficult to forecast, to predict how the economy will go further this year. But it is estimated that the 2022 real GDP could contract by 45%. This is one of the hardest or the highest declines in the economy of in the last many decades, for one country. And this is only under the assumption that the war will be more or less, finishing somewhere end of August, which is, again, as you know, economists, they need anyway to anchor something in front of them in order to build the models. But there is a high probability that the war may last longer, and therefore the effect will be much higher. Inflation is estimated, on the level of like a 20-25%, but again, can go higher, depending on the developments of the war. And the war brings a massive destructions to Ukrainian civilian infrastructure. And Russia uses all the types of weapons prohibited by international conventions, like phosphorus bombs, cluster shells, anti-personnel mines, to attack the homes, schools, hospitals, community centers. And this demonstrates the real face of the Russians and the goal of the campaign, as I said, to destroy the Ukraine as a nation. The Kyiv School of Economics, where I was also the member of the board in the past, estimates the total damages already occurred in the last 3.5 months on the level of $105 billion to Ukrainian economy. So these are damages of the infrastructure. But expected losses probably will climb up to $500-600 billion, and therefore there will be a huge need for the further reconstruction. I can continue about Ukraine, but it's not. The war is not only about Ukraine, because this unprovoked war started by Russia, affects all the world. The spillovers are much larger, and we estimate them, in the World Bank, in IMF, in different European agencies. I saw African Development Bank was doing, the United Nations were doing some assessments, and this will affect, unfortunately, many countries in Africa. And but not only, also in general the overall financial sector, and we will discuss it today. But few elements how the war affects the world and Africa specifically. First, let's not forget that the war currently goes after already high or huge distress world had as a result of COVID pandemics, because everybody was expecting that this year will be the year of revitalization. So like some kind of the increasing economy, everybody was so, positive about the developments, but the war completely changed those plans. According to the World Bank, the pandemic brought increase the number of poverty in the world by 100 million people. And this war will substantially increase this amount, unfortunately. Second is as you know, for the global economy, the war brings a high inflation. On top of what already was some kind of prerequisites for, or some reasons for inflation coming from post-pandemic period, the fuel, the energy, and the food shortages cause really already post-pandemic inflation. And this is, as we see the figures, they are on the level of multi-decades highs. And as we know, the inflation is a tax for poorest. And unfortunately, many countries in Africa will see these and increasing the food prices and increasing the fuel prices, which are the major basket for many poor people. Unfortunately, the poorest will pay much more price than the rich people during the war. And that I saw that African Development Bank looking at the wheat prices in Africa, reported about 45% increase in the wheat prices in Africa. And this will make, everything, let's say, from couscous to the in Mauritania, to the fried donuts in Congo, really much more expensive to the customers. But that increased prices, increased inflation, also according to the economic laws, will decrease demands. And when it will decrease demands, this will bring a higher unemployment in many countries. So this is what we will see, not only the high inflation, not only the tax for the poorest, but also for decreased demand, we will see the higher unemployment, which is already high in many countries as a result also of the pandemics. But on top of that, the prices is an important element, but on top of that, the Russia bears full responsibility for provoking global food crisis. It's not only about the prices. This is about the hunger. This is really about the hunger which may be brought to many countries in Africa. And there was analysis done recently, I think by McKinsey, that the countries which are mostly affected by the war in terms of the potential hunger risks are clearly live in the more Middle East, but also in the North Africa, which is Egypt, Tunisia, Libya, Morocco, but also in the Central Africa, Congo, Senegal, Namibia, Sudan. But I'm sure you know that, for example, nearly all wheat in Somalia comes from Ukraine, and due to the halted export through the Black Sea, this is a huge risk, for Somalia, really, of the huge hunger. And this is the timing for this could not be worse, because there are already, around 13, according to UN, there are around 13 million people who are facing the severe hunger in Horn of Africa region as a result of the drought, and another 18 million people are facing severe hunger in the Sahel region, where the farmers also see the worst agricultural production in more than a decade. And the UN World Food Program says that food shortages could worsen when the lean season arrives in late summer. So we're not yet there. And the problem is that so far the problems are with the supply of the last year harvest from Ukraine, but we will see now the new harvest, which market is expecting, because there are a lot of the storages from the past, some kind of something which has been already bought and supplied in the past. But the new supply, which should come in this autumn, will not come because of the blockades of the Ukrainian port. And what is more important, that Russia is going to use the risk of the famine, to put pressure on the world. So they use it as a blackmailing, and that's why I strongly believe that this is really like the country of sponsoring terrorism, because they do terrorism to the world, and that we need to understand that the only cause of the possible food catastrophe is Russia itself and its militarism, and stopping the war will, really decrease the risks which I was mentioning. And Russia, but if you go further, and I'm sure we will discuss it today, that Russia invasion also brings the really unbearable risk for the global peace in the world, also threatening the world with a nuclear power, with using the nuclear weapons, which, as we know, in the 21st century may lead to such unbearable risks for all the world, not just for one or two countries. And this is a nuclear terrorism. Just I'm sure we will discuss this, but one more important topic from economic side is as a result of inflation, the central banks in the world will have to increase the rates, in order to take the inflation down. This is the monetary instruments which central banks are using, and the Federal Reserve in the US already started doing that. And when they will do this, the other central banks will go. This will lead to substantial increase of the cost of borrowing in the world. And as we know, many countries in Africa are indebted with high debts, just because we had several decades of the so low interest rates. Actually, last 30 years was a period of permanently decreasing the interest rates. From 2010, the world, the advanced economies were living more or less with a zero cost money. Yes, Africa and Ukraine as well was still paying some price, but still we were borrowing, and the debt level in many countries is unsustainable. And now with a high increase, there is a big risk that the many countries in Africa will stay with the problems of paying the debts. And again, this is another spillover from the from the war. And look, as I said, the Russia should stop this war. The Russia should pay the price for this war. I'm sure the sanctions will play the role for Russia. But look, I know that it's not so clear maybe for many African countries, but this is the Russia which brings these risks to the world now. And Ukraine is actually fighting versus Russia in order to decrease those risks to the world. And let me stop here.
Thank you very, very much, Vladislav. And it's great to have economic matter discussed in such an accessible way, because sometimes I get lost with demand and supply curves. So thank you very much for a very clear explanation. And I think, Zvínka was saying that we're 100 days into the war. In fact, on the 24th of February, we held our first webinar, not part of this series, but we held a webinar with CST and Zvínka and some other speakers. And I think nobody imagined we would still be here 3.5 months later. So thank you very much for your presentation. Our next speaker will be Priyal Singh from the Institute of Security Studies, and I'm sure he's going to talk to us about what's been happening in the global governance sphere, with a focus probably on the United Nations and other institutions of global governance. Priyal and a colleague of his, Gustavo de Carvalho, wrote a very interesting paper for us at SIRE, looking at the way that African countries on the UN Security Council, have they empirically voted with Russia over the last 10 years or so. So that might be something that he brings up. But Priyal, over to you. You've got about 15 minutes. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Steve, and thanks, Zvínka. And good afternoon, everyone. One of the questions I was asked to consider is specifically how has this conflict played out at the United Nations? And I just very, very briefly want to just take us all back to 2006, when the Russian president first paid his first visit to Africa, and to take stock of the considerable growth in Russia-Africa political, military, and economic engagements since that visit, because I think the context matters here. So this grand re-engagement at both the bilateral and multilateral levels, as we all know, followed from years and years of waning Russian influence in Africa since the end of the Cold War, and this was particularly notable with respect to security cooperation. However, when compared to other major and emerging powers, Russia has remained a fairly marginal actor across the African continent. So from across economic sectors, trade and investment, development cooperation, the Russia-Africa relationship has in fact been vastly outpaced and far overshadowed by Africa's much more varied and comprehensive set of engagements with China, the European Union, the United States, India, individual European countries, and so on. But despite this, Russia is still perceived as maintaining a comparatively outsized degree of political influence across many African countries. And I think these perceptions came to a head in early March 2022 during the still ongoing emergency special sitting of the UN General Assembly, which was convened, of course, following the Russian invasion of Ukraine in late February, and also following the inability of the UN Security Council to adequately respond. I think we all, of course, given the composition of the Security Council and the powers that all permanent members maintain, all that the Council was really able to achieve was to simply pass a resolution calling for the convening of an emergency special session of the General Assembly. So this subsequent special session, which led to the adoption of Resolution ES 11.1, which inter alia condemned in the strongest terms Russian aggression against Ukraine in violation of Article 2.4 of the UN Charter. This resolution, was passed with 141 votes, 5 votes against. Came from African states. The number of African member states absentees at the emergency sitting was also disproportionately high at 69%. These two categories should not be conflated, as an abstention does not at all equate to being absent, but the net effect of these voting outcomes led to a noticeable continental split on the unfolding crises, with 28 African states voting in favor of the resolution, 17 abstentions, 9 absence, and Eritrea voting against the resolution. So certain African states that either abstained or were absent from the votes were in fact criticized for their perceived failure to condemn Russian aggression. And further, more general concerns were directed at the continental divide on this crisis. This was in part based on the African grouping's general disposition toward developing and championing common positions in order to better influence and shape global peace and security policy. So while these efforts have been most noticeable in recent years with respect to UN Security Council deliberations on peacekeeping and so on, broader continental alignment within other multilateral bodies is often viewed as a key goal for African states to pursue. So consequently, the continental divide on the adoption of Resolution ES 11.1 spurred greater debate relating to the nature and robustness of African multilateralism and the continent's collective commitment to uphold these values and principles set out in the UN Charter. These debates were further informed by broader commentary on the perceived influence and lingering hold of Russia over some African countries. And such perceptions have most often been explained and attributed to old bonds during the Soviet era and so on. But I won't go into too much detail on that. What I want to say is that the explanatory value of the preliminary assessments, have been somewhat limited, particularly in light of the fact that the many nuances that characterized political relations between the former Soviet Union and individual African states is very nuanced. It's complicated. It's different across all different African states. And these explanations often overlook the extent to which African states may base their international relations with the modern states of Russia on historical ties to the former Soviet Union. But we should remain cognizant of the fact that similarly, relations with Ukraine could be very much informed by these very same historical ties with the Soviet Union. The analysis of African states' positioning on this ongoing invasion with respect to subsequent resumed sessions of the 11th emergency sitting of the General Assembly, so that was Resolution ES 11.2 and Resolution ES 11.3, also remain mainly anecdotal at this stage. These commentaries have generally been framed within the continent's positioning within largely narrow binaries, overlooking the varied sets of foreign policy considerations that each African state needs to take into consideration in their positioning on this. So, with that being said, what stands out from the voting records of the two subsequent resolutions is, well, firstly, African states once again represented the highest total number of abstentions as well as the highest number of absentees relative to all other regional groupings on the General Assembly. In the vote which led to the adoption of Resolution ES 11.2, and this specifically focused on the humanitarian consequences of aggression against Ukraine. And this was adopted on the 24th of March this year. In contrast to the voting outcomes leading to the adoption of the first resolution, we saw just one fewer African state voting in favor of the second resolution, with 3 more African states abstaining and 2 fewer absentees. Eritrea, of course, remains the only African states across both votes which voted against either resolution. Interestingly, these trends dramatically changed in the votes that led to the adoption of ES 11.3, the third resolution stemming from this emergency sitting. And this, of course, focused on the suspension of Russia from the UN Human Rights Council on the 7th of April this year. In this vote, we see that whereas the Western and Eastern European regional groupings on the General Assembly maintain a very high degree of commonality or unity across all 3 resolutions, voting in favor of their adoption. But ES 11.3 received a far more mixed response across the African, Asia-Pacific, Latin American, and Caribbean groupings on the General Assembly. To this effect, only 10 African states voted in favor of the resolution, and that was down from an average of 28 across resolutions ES 11.1 and ES 11.2. 24 African states abstained on this third resolution, and this was up from an average of 19 across the 2 previous resolutions. This high number of abstentions was further mirrored by states from the Asia-Pacific grouping, which also recorded 24 abstentions, and that was up from an average of 13 across the 2 previous resolutions. 9 African states also voted against the resolution, which was significantly up from Eritrea being the only African states to vote against the 2 previous resolutions. And this was only second to the 10 states from the Asia-Pacific region which voted against the adoption of Resolution ES 11.3. So Stephen, in sum, I think it's safe to say that there really isn't a clear regional position that cuts through the African regional grouping on the General Assembly when it comes to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, as there is, for example, with the Eastern European and Western European groupings. Rather, individual African states are basing their positions on their own very specific foreign policy calculations. And this has led to a very clear split in voting outcomes within the General Assembly's 11th emergency special sitting. One could further argue, however, that the general voting trends we are witnessing across the African grouping point somewhat to waning African support for the resolutions, which are being adopted and supported almost universally by the Eastern European and Western European regional groupings. And I think it's important for me just to add that the Western European regional grouping on the General Assembly also includes the United States, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, Turkey, and Israel. Furthermore, we could also argue that this trend is not only confined to the African regional grouping, but is in fact mirrored by the voting outcomes seen from states from the Asia Pacific and from the Latin American and Caribbean regional groupings. Finally, I think the final point I'll make is, we will also ask the question, is there any impetus for UN reform? I think at this point, I can only really speak from a South African perspective, but we have definitely seen DIRCO dig in its heels on the need to call for UN reform and reform of the UN Security Council in particular. Minister Naledi Pandor and many other senior officials from DIRCO have pointed to the complete failings of the Security Council in maintaining international peace and security in the context of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And this is something that will likely feature in the lexicon of senior South African foreign policy officials for many years to come. I suspect that this will also likely form a far more prominent feature of South Africa's ongoing bilateral engagements, particularly with fellow member states from the non-aligned movements, as well as South Africa's upcoming potential multilateral appointments, such as its bid for a seat at the Human Rights Council, the UN Human Rights Council in 2023 as well. Thanks, Stephen. Thanks, Vinka. I'll conclude there.
Thank you very much, Priyal. It's very interesting that the first two votes, the numbers stacked up more or less the same. But when it came to excluding Russia and throwing Russia off the UN Human Rights Council, it was more nuanced and more split. And what we see is a continent divided, really very, very clearly, almost down the middle. And it was interesting. I was in another conversation yesterday with think tanks from around the world, and they were saying, many from the north, why is this? Are they not voting against? And it was important to unpack some of the things that you've unpacked: history, hypocrisy perceived by some countries, NATO expansion, etc. So I think what is for sure is that the international system is under pressure, and many questions are being asked, not least of them by President Zelensky himself, who in his televised address to the UN Security Council and the UN General Assembly was scathing. And said your whole reason for existing is to uphold international peace, and you failed us. So it will be very interesting to see if this crisis, is actually a turning point. That was one of the other things we were talking about yesterday. Is this a before and after moment? Is this, the opening salvo of the second Cold War? Are we going to really look at the 24th of February as a watershed moment, or is this only so for Europe? Does it have global implications? I think we've heard from both speakers that there certainly are global implications. And just before turning to Prof. Van Wyk, Johansi van Wyk, it's interesting that Macky Sall, the president of Senegal and also the chairperson of the African Union, along with Moussa Faki Mahamat, the chairman of the African Union Commission, were in Sochi a couple of days ago last week. They spent 3 hours with President Putin, ostensibly talking about making sure that food gets to Africa, grain and other exports from that part of the world, but also seemingly quite supportive of the Russian viewpoint. And I wonder, how, if there were a debate at the African Union today, whether countries would be as polarized as we've seen. I mean, we saw the countries sitting on the Security Council, for example, Kenya, the African countries are Kenya, Ghana, and who's the third one? Guinea, I think. All being quite vocal against Russia initially. So interesting to see how these positions change. But I think we've got no better person to turn to next, and that's Professor Johansi van Wyk. who works at the Politics and International Relations Department at UNISA, University of South Africa. We've also worked very closely with Prof. van Wyk on the peaceful use of nuclear issues in South Africa with SIA. So she can really talk to both the politics and the bombs that are looming over us. So Prof. van Wyk just also apologizes that her camera isn't working, so we'll be listening to her. But if you want to share your screen, Prof, please go ahead and do so. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Stephen. Good afternoon, everybody. And just a thank you to Dzwinka for organizing this very important discussion that we have, and also to Priyal and Vladislav for their presentations. I am going to share my presentation, and please indicate whether you can in fact see my presentation.
Yes, we can. Just put it. Can you put it on slide presenting mode, or is it a PDF?
It's a PDF.
Okay.
Can I use it like this, Stephen?
Yes, I think if you just make your screen a little bit bigger, you see that little arrow on the right hand side. That will just make it slightly larger.
No.
Okay. All right. No, that's fine. We can see it. So there we go. Go ahead.
I'm sorry about that, Stephen. Okay, so Stephen has talked about some of the defining moments and whether we can in fact refer to the events of 24 February as a watershed or a defining moment. In my view, it has been. We see some signs. We are not really sure of how it will play out at this stage, but we do know that there was a day zero on 24 February 2022, which has been significantly affecting Ukraine, and of course has meant that the global attention has shifted to Ukraine. But in my view, there's also been a precursor to these 2 days, and that in fact has been the Russian invasion and annexation of Crimea in 2014, where we've seen that since the invasion there has been signs of global governance and financial rupture that has been evident but very deftly covered by Vladimir Putin, tolerated by the international community and overshadowed by the pandemic and mega events which has drawn our attention. We know that global governance has seen some successes, especially in the recent context. There has been some unity and solidarity with Ukraine, but we've also seen, as Priyal has outlined in his research, that there has been some resistance. A divided continent on global governance issues, especially in the context of Ukraine, is clearly the case of Africa. But there's also been practical concerns. The initial ones has been NATO and the EU hesitancy and initial slow response time. One understands that global governance in institution of that nature is a slow tanker to turn around. And of course, then the threat, as we have come to know, of a Russian with a heavy hand that gets to the international community through various retaliation. So what is the outlook then of global governance? I am of the view that mega multilateralism is on the radar for some time, where the UN in its present form will remain as a major multilateral institution, and that is where the attention will be. But it is time that we consider mini but fit for purpose multilateralism, and here organizations such as the EU or BRICS can of course come in as sort of building blocks in a way then to reform this notion of mega multilateralism. One can easily say that the damaged architecture of Ukraine is a symbol of a broken global system. We see that there is a dictatorship of the veto in the UN Security Council that has meant, on the downside, that some of the decisions against Russia could not be taken. But on the other hand, the United Nations General Assembly seems to have stepped up to take this issue further by, I think it was under the tutelage of Luxembourg, has introduced a resolution that all of the decisions or vetoes taken by the Security Council will then have to be overseen and audited, so to speak, by the General Assembly. As Priyal has indicated, there has been a split on the African continent on support and on these various abstentions. There's been no shows, and of course, there's been against. South Africa, in the case of abstentions and voting against, has been the outlier that has attracted significant attention. There is still no mechanism to bring Russia to heel in the UN context. But it seems like the international legal architecture in terms of the criminal international law has been more efficient in terms of its evidence collection, as well as that of civil society trying to collect information. What is the outlook then? Is downscaling the UN system from a mega multilateral institution to more fit for purpose mini multilateral institutions the answer? And is the UN and its agency in its present form really fit for purpose? And is it not time to reconsider? Here I want to turn to what Stephen referred to as the address by President Selensky on 5 April to the United Nations Security Council. I would like to call this the Selensky challenge, where in a speech he has been very critical of not only the content and substance and purpose of the UN Charter, but also how the UN has operated since its establishment in San Francisco. He has, of course, outlined the Russian activities, the effects thereof, and of course, he has referred to the fact that there is a need for reform. He has referred to that there is time to transform the current system. And for this, he has proposed to convene a global conference in Kiev, and he has also, of course, given the invitation that he and Ukraine will be keen to host an institution that is an alternative to the United Nations. And of course, he has referred to Africa in his condemnation of some of the activities, where he said, where was the UN in Libya, for example, in Afghanistan, and also in other instances on the continent. But we know that the Selensky challenge to the UN system is not new. We know that over decades there has been multiple UN efforts for reform, but it has been a lot of talk. In the continental context of Africa, the Isolvani consensus has been adopted, but it has lost momentum. One can explain that as the continent has been trying to reinvent itself after the Kagame reforms. But we know that the post-Kagame reform on the AU is perhaps an opportune time to reconsider the Isolvani consensus and to, of course, lobby within the UN context for a renewed process. But I think that the continent must also be mindful of the post-pandemic international order, as well as new geopolitical realities. What can be or is the consequences of neglecting the so-called Zelensky challenge? Business as usual is likely to continue, which means that we will remain a world where issues of this magnitude, be it in the eastern part of Europe or elsewhere in the continent, will not receive the attention and solution that it is required. Power will remain in the privileged, those that have veto rights or those that have the money to buy off or lock roll votes at the Security Council. Global inequalities is likely to continue and manifest in, most likely, in bread and butter issues. And of course, on a global power balance of power scale, alternatives will become very attractive, be that good, mediocre, or unusual challenges. But what is the meta text of the Zelensky challenge? We know that the international power system, as espoused by the UN, cannot be reformed only. The reform of the international power system must go in tandem with a reform of the international financial system. There is a fallacy of capitalism with a human face and of sustainable development goals. Capitalism with a human face has not solved all our problems. Money thrown at underdevelopment areas and paying for the sustainable development goals will not necessarily be the panacea. We know that slogans often benefit those that are already in pound or dollar seats. So what can be the outlook? Symbolic attempts at UN and multilateral reforms are most likely to follow. Defense budgets is likely to soar, which means that less developmental assistance will be forthcoming. And most likely the sustainable development goals will suffer the same fate as the Millennium Development Goals. It may be resuscitated in a different kind of acronym, but we are, of course, unlikely to see significant progress in international development. If we speak about the role of the ruble in an international context, the ruble has reduced a lot of economic growth simply to ruble status. Vladislav has referred to the economic impact of the war that came on the back of the pandemic. And we know that these events have a psychological, political, and economic impact that, of course, will affect international markets and exchange rates. There will be a coming hunger. I suppose one can, in the Ukrainian context, refer to the Holodomor, if that is the correct pronunciation. So Ukraine is a country, as a point of reference for us, is a point of reference that hunger is a terror and of course the consequences thereof. But the question remains, why does Africa not produce its own food? Why do we sell large tracts of arable land to foreign investors? Why do we produce biofuel and not produce food? Who and how will the continent feed itself? We know that there is no such thing as a free lunch. It always comes with a ticket of an exchange that the continent will be facing. There is local consequences of this global event. Vladislav has referred to the effect on wheat prices that are already seen. Sunflower oil we have already seen. And for many people in the global south, the developing world, those products are part of the daily staple. An outlook that I foresee is that Russia is not, and it will not become a financial superpower. It is poor but powerful. And we can see that the Putinification will continue amongst its friends in the non-Western world or in the global south. We will also then see a shift from the ruble and the ruble to the renminbi or the Chinese monetary unit. It is gaining strength. It is an alternative that is attractive to other countries that wants to get out of the orbit of the so-called West. We know that China has become the donor and lender of first resort in some parts, and it remains to be seen whether the BRI, the Belt Road Initiative and Africa, will then help the continent to weather this storm. As an outlook, I suppose that a parallel financial universe will emerge or is emerging, with the dollar being set up against the yuan or the renminbi. A parallel global financial infrastructure can also become more prominent as the existing IFIs and local franchises, so to speak, of global South-led and financial institutions emerge. But for Africa, the events under discussion today is a dim reality check. We can expect less donor and humanitarian funding from the global north, as resources are directed towards military escalation and Ukraine's reconstruction and development. We know that Ukraine is not to blame, But for Africa, who benefits on the continent? Food that has been donated to the continent is often used as a political tool, in other words, weaponized. We can expect a drawn-out, unsuccessful UN, AU, and hybrid missions on the continent that is likely to remain given the current architecture that we are facing. The outlook is that donors will be flatlining, they will remain fatigued as they are mostly from the north and mostly preoccupied with events in eastern parts of Europe. The UN and international financial institutions reform will remain a myth, and the requirement is that the continent will have to come up with solutions that are practical and expensive within the budget. In conclusion, the international cost of a state running amok will increase. The events of Russia and the impact thereof in Ukraine is not only a call to our conscience, but it reiterates the importance of international checks and balances on state power. It is the era of the feast of dictators all over the world, where a handful and a small club of dictators are not only dictating to the people of their country, but also to the international financial and governance architecture. So-called authoritarian democrats win elections as under the cover of being democratic, but of course we know that is simply in procedure and not in substance. On another term, the military-industrial complex is likely to take away a lot of funding that could be invested into development, education, and the sustainable development goals. Nuclear envy will continue to be at the feast of these dictators' meetings. Territorial ambitions, as we've seen in Ukraine, is not limited to the Westphalian notion of the state. State sovereignty has not been limited to simply that as a symbol, but territorial ambitions remain, settling old, historic, perceived international scores and dealing with so-called and perceived past injustices will continue. We may want to ask the question, is the West a toothless monster that can throw money but is not willing to set boots on the ground? Although it is propagating the events in Ukraine and the war in Ukraine as a fight of the ages. We must look for alternatives and solutions, but we cannot use the existing ways of thinking and doing, hence the need for alternatives and solution 2.0. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Prof. van Wyk. I think you could have had an alternative career as an advertising copywriter or a poet laureate, because I love all your headings and slogans, and they're lots of fun, but also very meaningful. Thank you very much for that presentation and that view. We haven't had too many questions in the chat, so please, folks, if you want to type your questions in the chat, we'll be happy to get to them. I have some questions of my own, but let's get to the first one that was asked, and probably I'll start with in reverse order with you, Johansi. Jeremy Willie asked, can the invasion of Ukraine, the displacement of millions of civilians, the forced removal of thousands of Ukrainians to Russia, and the indiscriminate lethal bombing of civilian areas in eastern Ukraine be classified as a genocide? If yes, is the current global response, including from Africa, appropriate? And if not, why not? So I'll throw that to you first.
Thank you very much for that question. Of course, it is the question of the day. It is not only genocide, but of course it has been, in terms of the UN resolutions, also classified as crimes of aggression. Now we know that during the time of the formulation of the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court, there has been a long drawn out period of negotiations on what exactly is a crime of aggression, whereas we know that genocide is a more familiar or at least defined crime that falls within these crimes of humanities. The problem is that Russia stays out of the ICC orbit. We know also that the African Union and some states in Africa has serious concerns about the perception, or at least in empirical terms, the ICC's focus on getting African perpetrators in the dock. So within the African continent, it is important that the continent at least get its own legal house in order by getting the African court up and running, by at least show some force and commitment to dealing with continental legal issues before it can move up. Genocide within the continent is, of course, also something that is now upright in our mind, with the Rwanda genocide and, of course, some of the other genocides being on the radar. It remains for the continent an obligation to, first of all, get its house in order before it can stand in a corner and point fingers. Let me stop here, and we can, of course, entertain more questions in this regard.
Thank you. I think countries are very reluctant, even if it walks like a genocide and looks like a genocide, to actually name it a genocide, because then there are all sorts of implications that follow from that, including, in the African Union, where that's one of the grounds on which countries can intervene in their neighbors, according to the AU Constitutive Act. I don't know if any of the other panelists want to come in. Maybe
can I comment?
Yes.
Can I comment on that, because it's very interesting. I was speaking during last month on two big legal conferences, and we were discussing with lawyers the potential really implications of the issue. And as we discussed, Russia and its leaders are responsible for starting the war, and they must be brought to justice. And Ukraine and the world currently are documenting crimes. And the professor just said already that about the violation of the Rome Treaty, but not only, the UN Charter, the Article 2.4, has been violated because of the, aggression towards the sovereign country. The issues of Hague Convention from 1899, and the Russian soldiers, we just discussed now the global governance. I think it's a very important topic, global governance. Why? Because the advanced economies, they also stand for these values, for humanism and for the multiculturalism and for globalism. And the Putin wants to divide the world. And while advanced economies and the global north or the consolidated West, you may name it in different ways, they stand not only in favor of Ukraine, and that's why it's not a topic of NATO. Ukraine is not a member of NATO, and NATO is not fighting in Ukraine. Let's not forget. Let's not go to the Russian, propaganda, silence. Ukraine is fighting now to support the Western and the global values which the advanced economies, but in general the developed world was fighting for during the last 40-50 years. And Putin now puts a lot of questions because his type of the world, his view of the world is different. He said it about this many times. He said that liberal idea is dead. He said that he wants to show that democracy is not working in that part of the world. But look, he also wants to show that in Africa, democracy should not work. It's not the way of ruling the world. There are other options like autocracies, the dictatorship are the ways proper right the world. And he divides, by the way, it's very much important to recognize that he divides now, he tries to divide the world, and that's why global governance is important. We need to avoid the division of the world. We still need to go back to the multicultural concepts. But dividing the world, look at the lines on which he is dividing the world. This is exactly the issue of the humanism, exactly the issues of the multiculturalism and liberal and democracy. And if I may, address, our colleagues in Africa, it's a time to have a choice on which part of the line you are, where you want to be, more with a divided part of the world, which is threatening the world with a nuclear power, which is threatening the world with a military aggressions, which is threatening the world with blackmailing the world with a potential hunger, and bribing the world at the same time, saying, okay, if you don't go with me in this way, you know, you'll not get the cheaper oil, cheaper gas, or cheaper or cheaper food. And this is very much important to recognize. This is a moment, maybe next months or years, is a moment of the big divide, but we need to avoid this divide. And it's better to be on the right side if the divide happens, also on the global governance. But on one more important topic, you know, we discussed, I really like the concept of the no free lunch. I mean, even if you join that part of the world, just imagine, close the eyes and imagine that one day Russia comes to your country, to South Africa, comes and steal your diamonds, gold, uranium, platinum, palladium, copper, you know, some of these which are the major minerals which you have in your country, and sells to the world, saying, okay, I'm owing now this country, I will control this country, and I will sell this with a discount price to my allies, which could be another parts of the world, just because I do this. This is exactly what Putin now tries to do with exporting Ukrainian metal from Mariupol, which he took over the city. There was a metal in the city, and they tried to sell it now from the port which they control, you know, saying that they are the same with the grains, that we are supporting the war. This is exactly what you may observe in future, you know, with taking this free lunch today with Putin, and this is very dangerous, not only for one country in Africa or two countries in Africa, but in general for the global order. Again, it's time to take a right side of this war.
Thank you. Ioannis, I can't let you escape without giving us some comment on the prospects of a nuclear war. My daughter is studying International Relations 1, and I was reading with her some of her material, and they talked about the nuclear taboo, that even though nuclear weapons were used twice in the Second World War, since then there has been a reluctance to use them in a tactical or strategic manner, and they are in some ways unusable weapons. But you know, do we have to take Putin's threats seriously?
Yes, thank you, Stephen, and also to Vladislav for outlining some of the issues concerning NATO. Yes, the nuclear taboo is exactly what you explained, but we must also be mindful that if we study Putin or become students of Putinology, we have seen so far that he is a man that does not want to have this world order where you are constrained in any way. We have seen that he has had soldiers at Chernobyl. He has had other moves towards nuclear power stations. So he is unafraid of attacking those very institutions that is sort of the holy grail, that you do not go there. In my view, the Russians have also, part of their psyche is this blood sacrifice. We've seen it with the Kursk, we've seen it with a number of disasters, Chernobyl in the 80s, for example, that the Russians do not mind to put their own people in the front line. To die for Russia is the ultimate goal in life, hence the idea of this blood sacrifice. So what I'm saying is that Russia would not mind or hesitate to use some sort of biological or chemical or even a radiological weapon. It has done so before. We've seen it with the Skripal case. We've seen it with other cases in Europe. So in my view, it will not hesitate to use a weapon, even if it is against its own population. Of course, the consequences thereof will be worldwide. But Putin is a man that is of the position that everybody in Europe is against Russia, that wants to weaken Russia more. He wants to settle these old scores, and he will use whatever is taken. We are very concerned, of course, also about the accusations that Russia made of Ukraine still maintaining nuclear weapons, where Ukraine is, with South Africa, the two examples, and of course with Libya, of countries that have voluntarily ended their nuclear weapons programs. So this is now many years after, and he is still in that mindset. I hope I've tended to some of your questions, or at least your question, Stephen.
Thanks. Just before you go, it's a tangential issue, but you said that maybe it's time to reconsider the Ezulwini consensus, just so people know what that is. It's the decision that Africa puts forward for a reformed Security Council that would have 2 permanent members from Africa with a veto. Of course, Africa hasn't said who those 2 countries were, and there are at least 3 candidates. Nigeria, South Africa, Egypt, if not others. But just, Johansi, 1 minute on how you think that needs to be revisited.
I think the idea, thank you, Stephen, the idea that we want to entrench the idea of a veto, that is old school. We cannot stand by that decision anymore. If we want to reform the UN and the UN Security Council, we must do away of the veto. We must do away with a unique club that tends to these security matters. On the continent, we must also think of working harder with how to improve the relationship between the AU and the UN. We have seen some improvements, but clearly that is not enough. We need to have a conversation about whether the Ezulwini consensus is still the best way forward. In my view, it is not. We must be mindful of recent developments. And of course, the UN itself has had a high-level panel and others that have put proposals on the table. And we know that it will be a long time before that is ultimately accepted. Hence, the continent can play an essential role to get this conversation going again.
Thank you. That clarifies it. I'm going to let the panelists have 1 minute to conclude or give us some final thoughts. If you don't want to use it, you can pass your time. But maybe Priyal, just some thoughts to leave us with.
No, just thank you to your team and Zvinka's team. I think these conversations are necessary. This is probably going to be an ongoing crisis conflict for hopefully not too long, but the reality is that this may well go into months and years and so on. Maybe just final thoughts is